Hello, I'm Pastor Tim Holscher. Thank you for joining me today. We were looking last week at statements about the fact that we have died with Christ and have been raised with Christ. And I want to return to Romans chapter 6, and I want to move down to a verse in this context in Romans 6 that actually has a beautiful statement connected with something that we saw last week about being condemned or free of condemnation. And I'm just going to go back up to verse 4 where the Apostle Paul says, "Therefore we have been buried with him through baptism into death." So we've been looking at this, that we are in Christ and we have died, and we specifically have died to the sin, or as we would say, for clarification, the sin nature. And just as long as you don't understand it as like an entirely different person or entity with you. And he says, "Therefore, having been buried with him through baptism into death, so that as Christ was raised out from dead ones through the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in newness of life." The goal is not to stay in the death, but now to move into our life in Christ, which we talked about last week, and therefore walk or live our lives in newness of life. Paul makes, as he goes down through this context, he says in verse 6, "Knowing this, that our old," now notice the New American Standard here says our old self. And this word that is translated self is simply our word anthropos in Greek, which means man, the old man. The old man is not the old me particularly. It's not my old nature. It's all of us together as humanity, kind of in Adam is what he's saying. And he says, so that old man, what we were at one time, that was crucified with him. And he uses the same term that he uses in Galatians 2:20, jointly crucified with Christ. And the purpose of that is in order that our body of sin, that's what we're living in right now. We're living in this body of sin. What does he mean by that? That this body's nasty? No, it's that this body is dominated at the present time by this sin principle, this sin nature, that it might be not done away, but this verb that's translated done away, that it might be rendered idle, that it doesn't work like it's supposed to. So it's not that it's done away, it's just it doesn't work in that way, so that we should no longer be slaves to the sin. In other words, simply what he's saying is if you understand that you've been put into Christ's death, and as a result, that you were jointly crucified with him, then you realize that everything you were was crucified, with the result that at the present time, you actually, this present body dominated by the sin nature, can be liberated from the dominion of the sin nature. The one thing he's clearly not saying that I hear many people say and read is that the sin nature died, and that's because they confuse this expression, the old self or the old man, with the sin nature. If that were the case, we wouldn't have an issue anymore. I wouldn't have a sin nature problem. What he's saying is the me dominated by that sin nature is dead, so that I don't have to be a slave to the sin nature. This is what he's getting on. Then, now here's the point that I want to drive to. For he who, verse 7, has died to, or who has died, is freed from sin. Now, most all of your new translations, New American Standard, I've really appreciated the translation, but I think that they err here, because this word they're translating free is a verb dikaiao, which means to declare righteous. And I believe that the translators think that Paul's looking at this declaration of righteousness as though it's freedom from the sin. But this is not what he's really saying. What he's saying is, for us as a believer, we want to go back here to verse 4, that we want to walk in newness of life. And that's made possible because we've died to the sin nature. It's not that the sin nature died. It's not that the old man, the sin nature, that's not what he's saying. The old man, the me dominated by the sin nature, all of us together dominated by that sin, that died. And he says, because that's died, we're no longer slaves to the sin nature, and there having died to the sin nature, we're declared righteous. Now, we talked last week about the issue of condemnation. At least I think it was last week. And chapter 5 of Romans seems to associate the problem of our sin nature with our having been, or the problem of our sin nature results, in being condemned with Adam, coming under judgment, condemnation. Verse 7 is telling us, this is a promise here, that we actually are declared righteous because God sees us having died to the sin nature and therefore being separated from it. And this word, you don't see this in English. Let me pull the Greek text up here for this. Here in verse 7, it says being declared righteous. And even here, this is just simply the New American Standard placed underneath this. But this preposition apo is separated away from the sin nature. See, God sees us righteous because he separated us from the sin nature, from the very thing that condemned us. And that's why that Paul can then say, when we come back to Romans 8:1, as we were last week, there is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. I died to the sin nature, but I not only have died to the sin nature, but I have been separated from the sin nature. And being separated from the sin nature, I am free of condemnation. Separated from it. And that condemnation, being separated from no condemnation, that's hand in hand with the fact I'm declared righteous. You don't declare righteous a condemned man, and you don't condemn a righteous man. Well, they condemned Jesus Christ who is righteous. But that was in order that we might be declared righteous, those of us that were not righteous, those of us that were sinners. Plug that into your thinking. I am not condemned because I'm in Christ, and I'm righteous because God counts me to be separated, cut off from the sin nature. And I'm sure if you start thinking and looking at life with that perspective, you'll have a good day in the Lord. Thank you for joining me today.